one more minute, please. Thank you for, Mike Morris is already ready as well. We just, you're patient for one more minute, please. We will begin soon. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I would like to introduce Dr. Branko Burns, Regional Representative of CIMMYT in the Americas and Director of Integrated Development Strategies, who will be giving a welcoming message.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Very happy to see we have more than 80 people connected to this special seminar. This special seminar is part of the seminar series, Scenarios for the Future, How to Create Value in the New Normal. As you all know, we have within CIMMYT identified 3 phases of response to the unprecedented times we are seeing today. Phase 1 is to deliver. We're trying to deliver as much as possible to our current project portfolio as an institution. Second is contribute. We are looking and mapping how can we contribute to mitigate the impacts of the COVID measures on the food systems in the developing countries. And we're doing that through the CGIAR and as CIMMYT through several means. And last but not least, phase 3 is called Shaping the Future. How can we imagine a new future down the road when COVID is maybe with us but controlled, or COVID is over? Let's see how it works. And that is based on a strategic scenario building exercise to design and imagine a world 5 years from now that may look quite different on the one we have today. And how can CIMMYT and our capabilities then create value to that new normal? So in order to accompany that process of scenario building and imagination, we have invited a series of experts to give some seminars. And it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce today a well-known World Bank colleague who's well known to CIMMYT and very important, who knows CIMMYT very well. Michael Morris is a lead agricultural economist with the World Bank, currently mapped to the Latin American Caribbean region, Vice Presidency. He conducts research and is involved in the preparation, implementation, and evaluation of lending operations. He's a lead author of the World Bank flagship publications on fertilizer policy, agricultural commercialization, and drylands development, as well as a key contributor to the 2008 World Development Report, Agriculture for Development. And I'm sure many of you have read it and have used this report in many of your studies. His areas of expertise include agriculture policy, productivity enhancements, marketing systems and value chain development, agricultural innovation systems, institutional strengthening, and capacity building. Before joining the World Bank in 2004, he spent 16 years with the Mexico-based International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT, not a strange animal to all of you. Today, he is presenting us a little bit fresh off the press, and I don't know, this may well be one of the first seminars publicly given about this new study from World Bank called Future Foodscapes, Exploring the Unknown Through Scenarios. Michael, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you, Bram, for that very kind introduction. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to see the list of names of people participating in this seminar. I recognize quite a few names from what for me are the good old days, and it's really nice to be able to reconnect in this way. As Bram mentioned, there seems to be some sort of parallel thinking going on within the bank and also in CIMMYT in terms of trying to anticipate how the future is going to be different from today. And so what I'd like to do today is present some results from a big piece of work that a team has been engaged in at the bank for the last year and a half, really. As Bram mentioned, we're headed toward a report that's going to come out soon, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, in which we're really trying to envision the future of what agriculture and food systems might look like, particularly in LAC region, Latin America and the Caribbean. By design, what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk mostly about the sort of scenarios building work that went into this report. So I'm not going to try to cover the whole report, but just give you a little bit of a flavor of how we went about trying to visualize what might be happening in the future and think backwards and say, what should we be doing today, all of us who are actors in the food system, to be prepared for the future. I understand CIMMYT also is going to be doing some scenarios building work. There are lots of different ways to build scenarios. There's no right way or wrong way, but I think that the work that we've been doing here in the bank may provide some useful insights for the work that's being planned at CIMMYT. So without further ado, let me try to share my screen and let me know if you see this. Is that visible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, what I'm going to be talking about now is the scenarios building work that went into this report, Future Foodscapes, which we hope to launch probably in the next 3 weeks. I'm actually sitting here at my desk with a big stack of proofs from the printers that I've been going through the last couple of days, trying to identify the last little errors that need to be corrected. And so we're really, of course, having to change a little bit our plans for the launch. We had hoped to do it around the spring meetings of the World Bank when many people come to Washington, and we would have had a really big audience of people who have interest in the report. Now we're sort of rethinking our strategy and trying to figure out how do we do an online launch event. But we've quite far advanced now in the planning for that, and I'm sure we'll be sending also notices your way if anybody's interested in participating. Very quickly, why did we want to take on this report? Agriculture and food systems in Latin America and the Caribbean, are often recognized as among the most successful on the planet, right? So there's this sense that especially and the sort of super producers of the southern cone, but also increasingly many other countries in the region that are now big exporters. Agriculture sectors have contributed to regional growth. They've contributed to poverty reduction and shared prosperity. They've enabled the urbanization process, with Latin America now the most urbanized region in the world. And they've generated substantial exports to help feed the global population and help keep global food prices low, which of course helps combat poverty. But if you scratch a little bit and look beneath the surface, this public image of agriculture and food systems in the region as dynamic and productive and efficient reflects only part of a much more complicated reality, as many of you, of course, are well aware, since you do work in the region. Recently, we've also seen how agriculture and food systems in the region have attracted a lot of renewed attention, but often not in a good way. So there's been a lot of publicity about how, meat production is using to land use changes and driving deforestation, particularly in the Amazon. We've seen, news reports in the last couple of years of all the fires and the water pollution and the soil degradation that's contributing to climate change, and often attributed to the heavy environmental footprint of agriculture in the region. And more, we're becoming aware of the health impacts of the fact that the crops and that we're growing in the region and that people are consuming are not necessarily healthy and good for us. And so LAC now has the distinction of being the region that has the highest levels of obesity and overweight, and also significant at the same time micronutrient deficiencies and undernutrition problems throughout the region. So in that context, what we really wanted to do was launch an effort to try to reframe the dialogue around food, agriculture, and food systems in the region, and to shift people's thinking away from this idea that, agriculture, on the one hand, a sort of simplistic view that everything's great, and LAC is the sort of supermarket to the world export powerhouse. And then on the other side of the divide, sort of this thinking that, well, agriculture is just a real disaster environmentally, and it's driving deforestation, and it's contributing to climate change and leading to all kind of health issues, which is not a balanced picture either. Now, this effort is not something that the World Bank has been undertaking alone. We did this report with a lot of collaborators. You see them on the screen. And that was a very deliberate effort. We know that there are many parallel conversations going on around agriculture and food systems, often on the same themes and often with the same messages, but in many cases, these conversations have been going on in separate spaces. So we wanted to try to bring a real range of actors together and try to frame a set of messages in which we're really speaking with a common voice. So we were very happy to be able to collaborate with these and actually also some other actors who have contributed to the report. Very, very quickly, I'm going to sort of skip over this part, and when the report comes out, you can read it. But the basic conceptual framework of the report is that we argue that agriculture and food systems matter because they contribute sort of to four big buckets of outputs that are somewhat different, but they're all very important. So the first one is agriculture growth and diversification. The agri-food system remains important in many countries in the economy, and is a contributor to growth in ways that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I'll do one slide on each one of these four big buckets. Secondly, agriculture and food systems contribute to employment and poverty reduction. They generate a lot of jobs, contribute to incomes, and help reduce poverty numbers throughout the region. Third, food and nutrition security in terms of assuring an accessible, nutritious, stable, affordable food supply, both within the region and around the world. And then fourth, agriculture and food systems have a huge influence on the ability of the biomes in the region to continue delivering the climate resilient ecosystem services on which we all depend. So very quickly, as I said, I'll just skim over this part. The report presents quite a bit of information about the sort of current, is sort of a stock taking exercise. A lot of this is not necessarily new information. It's information that's out there, and a lot of good work has gone on in many of these areas. In the report, we try to pull together numbers to show people and to make clear the importance of these four big buckets. So in terms of agriculture's contribution to growth and diversification, we make the point that often the impact of agriculture is underestimated because traditionally statistics really focus only on primary agriculture, and they don't take into account backward linkages into the input supply industries, and they don't take into account forward linkages in downstream value adding food service all the way through to the end of the distribution chain. And so we try to put some numbers together in terms of showing the importance of agriculture and food systems, considering not only the narrowly defined primary agriculture, but the much larger food system. We also stress and put together some numbers in terms of the contributions to contributing to the global food supply. In the past, it was very much dominated by cereals and soybeans exports from the Southern Cone, but now we're seeing huge volumes of exports from Central America, from the Andean countries, increasingly made up of fruits and vegetables and high value products. Employment and poverty alleviation, some numbers on the percentage of populations that are still making their living or relying on agriculture and food systems as a primary livelihood source. In LAC, generally speaking, the numbers are not the same as they would be in Africa or in South Asia, but they're still very high in many countries. And we also do some analysis looking at wage rates and payments that people receive in the sector and what happens when they leave the sector. Looking at sort of structural transformation processes, we know that as economies grow and develop, the primary agriculture sector tends to shrink. We see people leaving rural areas, moving to cities increasingly in search of work, moving out of primary agriculture into the services industries and to some extent in manufacturing. And there's this sort of stereotypical view that that's always associated with income gains, and it turns out it's not necessarily. That for many of the low-skilled workers who are leaving agriculture and taking up jobs in the service sector, often in the informal economy in the city, they're not necessarily moving to more productive and higher-paying jobs. Food and nutrition security present a lot of statistics on what we call the triple burden of malnutrition. The fact that at the same time we see undernutrition, people not having enough to eat and not meeting minimum daily requirements, coexisting in the same countries and often in the same places with overweight and obesity, and then all the micronutrient deficiencies that are associated with imbalanced diets or incomplete diets. And putting together some of the numbers about the prevalence of the problem, which, particularly in terms of overweight and obesity, unfortunately, many Latin American countries, including Mexico, really are leading the tables globally. And finally, there's quite a bit of information presented on the impact of agriculture on the environment and vice versa. Deforestation, of course, we're all aware of as being a big problem, trying to put some numbers on that. And then also other aspects of the environmental footprint of agriculture, looking at water use, at losses of biodiversity, and so on, trying to show how the performance of agriculture is really inextricably linked to the performance of environments. So in that context, the objective of this report that we put together was really to shift from a complacency about agriculture to think, well, it's not doing so badly, and in fact, in many places it's doing well, but really to direct renewed attention by decision makers and private investors on agriculture and food systems as a really important source, not only of local public goods, but also of global public goods. You know, it's really interesting to see in the World Bank, our main points of contact in the countries that we work with are not ministers of agriculture, of course. The World Bank as an institution engages mainly with ministers of finance, not surprising. And so the interesting thing is that when ministers of finance come to Washington for whatever reason, if they're from African countries or from many South Asian countries, very quickly the conversation turns to food and agriculture issues. In Latin America, that's very rarely the case. In such a heavily urbanized region, you know, the issues that are foremost on the minds of most ministers of finance are really more urban related problems, which makes sense. 80% of the population in many countries is lives in cities now, often in the main capital area. So when the ministers from Peru, from Colombia, from Mexico, from so many countries come to the World Bank in Washington and they want to talk about assistance from the bank, what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about the Lima metro system or the Bogota water supply services or urban education systems and so on. But very rarely does agriculture and food come into the picture. And so we really looked at this report as a way to help refocus attention to look at the food, agriculture and food systems much more broadly, and to realize the many different ways they impact on social objectives that aren't always immediately associated with agriculture and food systems. And so then the report sort of looked at these three key questions that are identified here. We asked, looking forward, what are the major drivers that are going to shape the evolution of agriculture and food systems within the region and worldwide? What are the main threats to the stability of agriculture and food systems, and what are the major opportunities? So let me focus now on the scenarios building work that we did, which I have to say was, for me personally, very interesting. Years ago, while at CIMMYT, of course, we did some scenarios building work in this context of developing strategic plans. So what I think CIMMYT is embarking upon now is a continuation of a long tradition of doing this kind of work. But I certainly don't consider myself an expert on scenarios building. And so this exercise for me was very sort of informative and interesting. And fortunately, we were able to rely on some very good support from some folks who sort of do this for a living and have a lot more experience in putting these things together. In our case, we combined quantitative methods with qualitative methods. So on the quantitative side, we did a lot of work with two teams from IFPRI using models which will be familiar to many of you. The impact model, which is used a lot to do sort of projections of impacts on food trade flows, food prices, food production. And then the Miragrodep model, which is maybe less familiar to many of you, which is very useful for looking at policy shock. You can shock it with policy changes. You know, what happens if you know, China doubles import tariffs? What happens if you know, the US retaliates, kind of thing. So we did quite a bit of work looking with these quantitative modeling tools projecting out about through 2030 is most of the report. For the climate change impacts, you really have to go out a bit further to start really picking up big effects. But generally speaking, we're kind of looking at a 15 to 20, well, a 10 to 15 year time frame in most of our work. The quantitative methods were then complemented with some qualitative work. And here we got a lot of help from colleagues from McKinsey and Company, who do this sort of regularly, these kind of qualitative projections. And I'll talk about them in a minute. But there we invited a set of about 35 participants who were very carefully chosen to represent a diversity of views. So we had, I think, 6 vice ministers of agriculture. We had people from the large international multinationals, the Cargills and the John Deeres and the private sector. We had people from research organizations. We had people from the CGIAR, scientists and more academic types. We had people from NGOs that are either in civil society organizations who are very active both on the social side in terms of promoting smallholder agriculture, for example, and also on the environmental side. And we had many representatives of producer organizations and as well as people from the international financial institutions. And so during a workshop that was hosted by IICA at their headquarters in San Jose, we went through a sort of qualitative exercise that I'm going to describe in a minute. As part of our scenarios building work, we recognize 2 very different types of drivers that are really likely to be influential in shaping the future course of agriculture and food systems in the region. On the one hand, you have trends that are very large scale, slow moving, gradual, but very certain, which we know are influencing the evolution of agriculture and food systems. Things like population growth, income growth, urbanization, these things, the steady productivity gains that give us 1% productivity growth per year sort of thing. And then some of the longer term impacts of climate change, the very gradual warming, the gradual wetting or more commonly drying of certain areas. So that's one type of driver that we know the food systems are going to have to respond to. The second type of driver is much less predictable, the disruptors, we call them, which tend to be very sudden, very uncertain. We know they're probably coming, but we don't know when. So they tend to really catch us by surprise. And so in that category are things like macroeconomic policies, which can change suddenly and overnight. Big demographic shocks, for example, the sort of Venezuela experience, right? Driven by socio-political events, but suddenly leading to large-scale mass migration that can affect food systems. Changes in demand for food can actually also be very, very sudden, and so we're seeing some things now about the rising demand for plant-based protein sources, alternative meats, which are really very quickly shaping the whole meat industry in ways that really probably weren't anticipated 15 years ago, and so on. Technologies, of course, disruptive technologies that can really change the way that food is produced, processed, transported, and consumed. And then some of the short-run impacts of climate change. We know that the increasing frequency and severity of disruptive weather events and natural disasters. So distinguishing between those 2 types of drivers, I'm going to describe now the work that we did in the workshop in San Jose. So with the help of the IFPRI models, particularly the impacts models, those are very good at allowing us to anticipate the effects of the trends, really the slow moving drivers. So things like gradual productivity gains in agriculture, population growth that's pushing up the demand for food around the world, and so on. Even climate change, we can gradually, with the impact model, gradually crank up temperatures, use our crop models to see how that's going to affect yields, translate that into production changes, map that on the ground in terms of the location of production. And so we can sort of pick up those long-term trends quite well with some of the quantitative modeling tools. The disruptors are much more difficult to model. And so that's what we really focused on during the workshop. And in this screen, you can see the sort of big categories of disruptors that we considered. So macroeconomic forces, big changes in global energy prices and exchange rate effects, which can really shock systems and disrupt trade flows. We looked at demographic shocks of the Venezuela type. We looked at changes in the demand for food, increasing demand for more healthy and nutrition food, reduced meat consumption, the rising importance of the eat local movement, that people are much more concerned about supporting agriculture in their communities and so on. We looked at climate change impacts, and then on the supply side, some big structural changes that could really affect the future of agriculture. We know that water scarcity is becoming a huge effect, the way, where and how food is produced and processed and consumed. Food loss and waste, another huge topic, which is getting a lot of attention now as we understand more and more about what a large impact that actually has. The enormous differences between how much is actually grown and how much actually ends up getting consumed by people. Adoption of improved technologies and the extent of land degradation are also factors which could really affect the future supply side of the equation. We looked at a bunch of changes in technology, genomic technologies, precision agriculture, alternative proteins, automation, big data, trying to think through how those might affect food systems, and finally, policies and regulations. Now, the way that we did this was actually quite interesting, and this is where McKinsey and Company, a method that they use that we adopted, which we found to be super useful. So for all of these disruptors that are listed on the previous page, for each one, we created these cards. And so this is an example of just one card out of however many it was, 18, 20, 30. I think there were 30 of them in all, actually. And each card, what we did when we put together the cards, we would look at the disruptor, which in this case is in the larger category of macroeconomic forces, but we're looking at commodity prices. And we said, okay, what are the extreme values that would be plausible by 2030? So here's an example. The price of maize in 2030, who knows what it is today? What is it today? $90 a ton, something like that. Gulfport's #2 yellow maize, probably $100. So we kind of imagine, well, one plausible extreme value could be that the price of maize would rise to $250 a ton. And then on the back of the card, we would have the other extreme that would be plausible, right? And so there we said, well, the other extreme would be, it might go all the way down to $75 a ton. So for all of the cards, we had these two values. And in the workshop, we formed into working groups of 5 or 6 people with a diversity of views. And we would deal each working group a set of 4 or 5 cards with one side up, one or the other. And so then based on that combination of disruptors, their job was to imagine the world that would ensue by 2030. If you said, let's say, global commodity prices up, changing tastes and preferences, and you run out of water, and what would be another one? And the exchange rates changed dramatically. And so they would go through that, and then we would then turn over the cards as an example of sort of shocking people's thinking and say, what if the other extreme values prevail? And after doing several rounds of that, we converged on a number of scenarios. We found that people were really coming up with quite similar scenarios, either because they had the same sets of cards to start with, or because different combinations of these drivers were leading to very similar outcomes. And what we finally did was distilled, and this is work that we did after the workshop ended, but we distilled this larger set of scenarios down into sort of 5 scenarios that are presented in the Future Foodscapes report. And I'm not going to go into them in detail here. If you're interested, you can read the report when it comes out. But we called them the Age of Exodus, which, as you can imagine, is driven by a lot of climate impacts on agriculture, by demographic shocks due to socio-political events and so on, in which we really see a lot of movement of people around the region. We had another one, Healthy Diets Rule, where actually very strong demand side demand for healthy and nutritious diets, rising consumer awareness leads to really a strong reconfiguration of food production systems. We had another scenario, Fragmented World, which is driven basically by trade barriers around, where countries get into situations where they stop trading. And you see a much greater emphasis on self-sufficiency, national self-sufficiency, which in turn, as you would expect, drives expansion of area devoted to agriculture, starts having environmental impacts, maybe restricts the availability of certain types of food for countries that can't produce themselves, that rely now on trade, and so on. Fourth scenario, which we called LAC Agri-Export Powerhouse, is basically driven by very strong growth in demand for food in other parts of the world, and huge demand on Latin American systems to produce surpluses to feed those other regions. And then finally, Agri-Food 4.0 is kind of the high-tech, technology-driven agriculture of the future, a lot of urban agriculture, a huge reliance on digital technologies, all kind of implications for employment and the types of jobs that are created in the system, and so on. So it was a very rich exercise, actually, and fascinating to see. The process was probably as interesting as the outcomes, because in these working groups, we would see how, depending on who you were and what your background is and what constituency you represent, problems and outcomes were identified in certain ways, our people's innate biases coming through. But then in the process of group discussion and reaching consensus on what would actually happen, I think it was very sort of eye-opening for many of us, and I'm sure that's also in large part one of the objectives of the exercise that CIMMYT is preparing to undertake. So, as I said, in the report, there's a lot more discussion about what drives these scenarios, how you get there, what are the signposts along the way to give us clues that these are the scenarios that are emerging. What we did do during the meeting was then say, well, what does it mean? What are the actions that we should be taking today to prepare for these scenarios, right? And so we came up with a set of what we call in the report proposed actions, and there are about 20 of them in all. It's very hard to find a suitable sort of level of detail, because you can do this at a super high level, or you could do it at a very, very granular level that rapidly gets out of control. but we ended up with 20 proposed actions, which we classified into two big categories, what we call the imperatives and the strategic choices. And within each of those categories, then there are also two subcategories in each one. Again, this is a modification of the scenarios building methodology that McKinsey used, but we found it actually very helpful and it provided a lot of insights. So within the imperatives are actions that governments and policymakers really should take because they're going to pay off no matter what, or the consequences of not taking them are just unacceptably high. And so the two subcategories that I just referred to are the no regrets actions that'll be taken in all scenarios and in all outcomes. You should take them because they're going to pay off. Some of them require high amounts of investment. Some of them don't require particularly a lot of investment. They may just require changes in laws or regulations. And then the second category of imperatives are the risk mitigation actions, things that we really need to take today because, you know, if certain scenarios come to pass and we haven't taken these actions, the consequences are just going to be really disastrous. The second big category of proposed actions are what we call the strategic choices. And these are ones that are not mandatory, but they may or may not be desirable depending on the particular circumstances of a country and the country's policy objectives. So one of the categories of strategic choices are called options open, right? So these are probably not huge actions, but they're actions that keep a country, and at this point, you know, in this scenarios building exercise, we're approaching this from the perspective of countries. If you did the whole exercise, McKinsey, for example, usually do this from the perspective of companies, individual companies, which is a very different dynamic, it turns out. But from a country point of view, which we were looking at now, thinking that we're trying to generate information that's going to be useful for policymakers, there are some actions that you want to take to be able to keep options open going down the road. And then the final category, which has the most uncertain outcomes, the outcomes are becoming more and more uncertain as we go from left to right, are what we call game changers. And these are really big things. They may have high risks, but they could have high rewards. They may or may not come to pass. And so we sorted the proposed actions into those four categories. I won't go through them in great detail, but just so you can see, sort of get a flavor of what they look like and the level of generality, right? So no regrets actions are things like, and we talk about these all the time, right? Strengthening research and extension systems, modernizing agri-logistics, upskilling food system workers through capacity building and training, you know, promoting healthy diets. These are things that you can't really go wrong doing. The risk mitigation actions, investments that we want to be taking to avoid really going off the rails if some of these disruptors show up. So stepping up climate monitoring, strengthening our defenses against foodborne diseases, building social safety nets that can be activated quickly in times of crisis, and so on. The other two subcategories of proposed actions, which come under the strategic choices window, the options open actions, meaning maintaining access to new markets for products to allow food and agriculture systems to continue expanding, investing in irrigation, you know, where water scarcity is becoming more and more binding, supporting the development of investing in biofortification and nutraceuticals, basically all of the new genomic technologies. You know, do countries want to continue to invest in that area so they have the capacity to play in the game in the future as those fields evolve, and so on. And then the game changers are really big ones. There's sort of one in each of the 4 big buckets category. One would be really decoupling all production support to agriculture, and there's a description in the report what that means as a sort of economics technical term. Ensuring that all agri-food system work is safe and fair. Huge problem around the world is that the labor conditions for agricultural workers, there's so much informality, and even where there are formal labor markets for agriculture, often there's special concessional terms that mean that agricultural workers don't have the job security, don't have the health and social protections that workers have in other sectors. So a big game changer would really be to make a commitment to bring agricultural labor and food system labor up to the same standard as others. Making food systems carbon neutral. I think we all have a sense of what that would imply, and then really declaring war on junk food and really taking on some of the nutritional problems that we see in agriculture. So coming to an end, I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor for how the scenarios building exercise actually worked. And so sort of what were the final conclusions? One, todo cambia, right? That the system the future is ultimately unknowable. And so the only thing that we know is that there are going to be changes. And the scenarios building work really is valuable because they force us to contemplate worlds that normally we wouldn't think about. And they force us to consider the types of actions we might want to take on to prepare for realities other than the ones that we've experienced. More generally, for the entire report then, getting beyond just the scenarios building work, what we try to emphasize as the main take-home messages are that agriculture and food systems are actually much more important in sort of more diverse ways than most policymakers normally recognize, particularly policymakers from outside the sector, right? So this sort of traditional mentality in Latin America, when we think about agriculture, we think about, small farmers growing maize on hillsides in Latin America, or we think about giant soybeans producers in Argentina and Brazil, or we think about sort of cattle ranching. That's just a very small part of the food system, as important as it may be. And when we think about all of the value addition that follows that further downstream in the value chain, agriculture ends up being much more important in terms of jobs, in terms of economic growth, than is usually recognized. We think it's going to continue to play that role in the future. And for that reason, the sort of last message is that the future of these systems is far too important to be left to chance. And it's going to have the performance of the agriculture and food systems of the region are going to be important not only within the region, but also globally because of the huge importance of LAC in terms of exporting food to the world and in terms of the huge importance that the ecosystems in LAC have in performing global environmental regulation functions. So that's where I'm going to end. Sorry, I've gone on maybe a little bit longer than intended. Let me stop sharing my screen and go back to you, Bram. Are you going to field questions, I understand?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for this. And it was a very, very interesting overview, very interesting exercise. And I think it has quite some food for thought for us. I have a first question here in the chat group. So allow me to give you how is the agricultural product, meat, vegetable, transported from the landing side to the market? Vehicles used, means of preservation, costs involved. Can that be taken into account?
I'm sorry, can you, your audio faded out. This is the problems of Zoom right at the beginning. What was the first? I missed the verb in the list.
How is the agricultural product transported from the landing site to the market?
Okay, yes, now I see it, and I see it in the chat function. Well, you know, I mean, there's no easy answer for that, right? So it depends on what kind of production you're talking about. Two things are that agrologistics for the sort of traditional exports from LAC, things like soybeans coming out of the southern cone and so on, those are generally non-perishable products. And so the challenges are very different there. The challenges have to do with big distances getting products inland to ports where they can be exported to the world and so on. In the last sort of 10, 15 years, as incomes have risen, as populations have been concentrated more in cities, as consumers have become wealthier and more educated, and in some cases more conscious of nutritional impacts, demand for perishable, high-value fruits, vegetables, dairy products, and meat and fish has risen a lot. And that's really created strains on the transport network, because with these perishable products, obviously we need a very different type of infrastructure. We need cold chains, and we need traceability in many cases, that traceability systems that don't work. We need good food safety monitoring. In a few countries, we've seen supermarkets come in, the Walmarts of the world and the Costcos, which actually have integrated their supply chains. So they've captured, they manage the crop or the products themselves from the level of the farm all the way to the supermarket shelf. But that hasn't happened everywhere. We recognize in the report that there's sort of what we call three sort of stereotypical food systems: traditional food systems, transitional ones, and then modern integrated ones. The traditional and transitional ones are still very common in the region. So we see a lot of transporting of food still being done using very outdated methods, and a lot of loss and wastage, actually. So there's no single answer to that question, but a lot of things going on and a lot of room for improvement.
Thanks. Another question, the inevitable one
thank you.
that you could see. How was an event like COVID-19 taken into account in your scenario exercise?
Well, I was waiting for that question. And so, we did not, I have to say, we did not include, and that it's a good example of why these disruptors sometimes are really what they call black swans that come out of the blue. We didn't explicitly include or foresee a global pandemic as a disruptor. One of the disruptors were food health and safety problems, food quality problems that could lead to disease, but not on the scale that we've seen with COVID.
Thank you, and that leaves us probably with a task to do that part of the job.
Well, fortunately, I have to admit that it also caused a bit of scrambling in terms of updating the manuscript of this report. So, one of the reasons it's been delayed a bit is we did go back and we've actually integrated into the report quite a few references to what an event like COVID means for the food system. I think the interesting thing, and many people will be observing this around the world, the immediate impact in many places has not been so much on the supply side. I mean, we have seen some isolated cases initially, particularly like the meat packing plants in the US that have had to close because of health problems. But in most places, the supply side has been pretty robust. The problem has been just the absolute cratering of demand, right? So people, the demand for food, and particularly institutional food, restaurants, schools, institutions. And so the problem hasn't been that there isn't enough food. The problem has been that the demand for food is either decreased a lot, or it shifted to other areas. People now, sitting at home and consuming food at home when previously they would have been eating at school, they would have been taking offices in restaurants near where they work, downtown, and so on. So those have been the big impacts, not supply constraints per se, yet.
Yet. So let's see what that will be in the future. Another question is, how will the bank bridge between sectors? As we have seen that a lot of the solutions in the agricultural sector are actually coming from outside of this agricultural sector.
Well, it's a very good question. So we, of course, recognize the multi-sectorality of many of the interventions that are needed. And, the World Bank is like any other institution, including CIMMYT, right? In that we kind of go back and forth in terms of our organizational structure to try to figure out what is the best way to maintain strength within each thematic area, within each sector, and yet still maintain strong incentives to collaborate across sectors. And the bank reorganizes about every 3 or 4 years to try to adjust that balance, and we never get it perfectly right, for sure. But I think in what we have tried to do traditionally through the years is really build strong links between sort of all of the sectors that relate to the 4 big buckets that I talked about. So, in the agriculture and food practice, we of course look at production and consumption issues, but we try to work in the projects that we design, for example. So there's always a transportation component because we're thinking about the logistics of moving food around. Water is actually a separate global practice in the bank. So water also comes into the picture, whether it's on the irrigation side, because we know that irrigation uses 80% of the freshwater resources that are used in around the world, or also increasingly on the processing side. We try to work with our colleagues who work on regulatory policy and business environment. Agriculture, after all, is a private sector activity. Much less so than some of the other sectors in education and health, which are still much dominated by public agencies. So getting the regulatory climate right is also critical. So we try to collaborate and bring all those different actors in the picture as best we can, sometimes with more success, sometimes with less success. There's always still incentives to try to, maintain strong work programs within each sector. So there's always a bit of rivalry too about who gets to lead and so on. And sometimes, frankly, that gets in the way. But that's life. We work around it as best we can.
Thank you. Another question is, if we see the importance globally, 30% of the global GDP is ag-related, from wheat fields to whiskey and tractors. FAO published 1/3 of global jobs in agriculture are in agriculture. But still, and I'm sure this is a question close to your heart, still only globally 5% of R&D is invested in the agricultural sector. And what do we need to do, or what can we do, or why can't agriculture get a higher priority investment in institutions like the World Bank and others? How can we change that?
Well, I hope that with a kind of report that a little bit is one of the reasons why we're producing a report like that, is to redirect attention back to agriculture and food, to get people to think more broadly about the importance in many different dimensions. I don't know where that 5% of R&D goes to ag figure came from. We know that the private sector investment is really hard to estimate, actually, because it's not publicly available information. And I would say also that many of the sort of emerging digital technologies are completely relevant for agriculture and ag business. So that 5%, I think, is really an underestimate, because all of the work that's been doing with remote sensing, with digitalization, with machine learning, with artificial intelligence, all of those things are applicable to agriculture. I think that that maybe the way to direct more applications to agriculture space is to make agriculture and food more of an attractive and profitable undertaking. You know, it's profit. I hate to sound like a World Bank economist now, but it's at the end of the day, right? It's economic incentives that are going to drive private sector investment into those areas and put those applications to use for agriculture and food. And that's not going to come from ministers saying you must do it. It's going to come from entrepreneurs saying, wow, here's a huge opportunity, and I can use this technology and put it to work here.
Thank you, Mike. We know we are 6 minutes over time, and I want to be especially conscious that you are in the year-end closure, and for sure a lot of technical reporting on your desk. So I would propose, you have many other questions, so can we send those to you, and then we will publish them on intranet with some Q&A when you have a chance. We can have a quick interview to respond to some of those. Thanks for everybody who was online. Mike, any final comment to close off?
No, I mean, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to make this presentation and to share this. As I said, we will be distributing links to some kind of an online launch event, and then copies of the report will be available, and would welcome feedback on it as well. Maybe just one kind of closing comment is that you know, wearing another hat. Another thing that I do is I'm one of the World Bank representatives on the System Council, right, which is so actively involved these days now in trying to promote the One CGIAR movement. So I just kind of on a different theme, I just want to say that I want to emphasize how the main donors really seem to be behind that. And, you know, we understand how, yes, it creates uncertainty about the future evolution of the system. But from where I sit, and of course I'm a very loyal supporter of the CG, given my background. I really do think that it is something that could really be a game changer for the system, and could really and should work out really well. You know, the timing now with COVID, of course, complicates things even more. But I would say to everybody, don't get discouraged. You know, look at despite the uncertainty that's associated with this change, I really think it's foreshadowing what are going to be better days ahead and stronger support from many of the donors, is from what I'm hearing in these meetings that I'm participating in. So keep the faith, and you know, I think things will work out for the better.
Thank you, Mike. And I think with that, you leave us with a very strong task. Let's use the scenario process to shape the future, and use the One CGIAR to have a clear value proposition for that. And I'm sure the world needs that. Thanks for being an ally to CIMMYT. Thanks for being active in the CGIAR also. And I'm sure this will not be your last seminar or conversation on the future of agriculture in Latin America and the world. Thanks to everybody online. This was yet again a very successful seminar with 100 participants, Mike. So congratulations for that. And stay tuned for more seminars on this special series. Thanks a lot. Stay safe. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other, and stay gentle. Goodbye.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.